You probably need some lay people here, sometimes even religious figures might be part of your institutional board. These are very important, but you also need the scientists there too, because it's all science as well. It's not just, you know, you have to have like a very heterogeneous background. The gender background is very important. The institutional boards should have a very good share of both genders there. And the race, also the cultural background. So it's very important when they choose the people in the institutional boards, they have to be very heterogeneous. And this is very important for when they want to approve a research. What they usually approve, what kind of criteria do they use to approve? But when the protocol comes into an institutional review board, well, they're looking at risks. They want to have the least amount of risks. There should be a good risk and benefit ratio, a favorable one. Again, as we talked about justice, there should be justice in when you're selecting volunteers or patients. Informed consent is very important, that this should be obtained, it should be documented. The data should be monitored, and especially for safety and for being credible. The privacy, as we talked, should be protected, confidentiality should be maintained. And there will have to be a lot of safeguards for those individuals that cannot maybe decide for themselves. So when an IRB is looking at a protocol, they're looking at these are the criteria they will use. This is also very important that we have this in mind. But what we do in publication, what is required in the publication is when reporting research is involving humans or animals, the authors should state whether there was ethical clearance by institutional or national review committees. If there is no, sorry for the typo, if there is no formal committees that exist, they should at least state that this research was performed in accordance with the Declaration of Helsinki. So as I mentioned before, sometimes there might be places that they still do not have maybe institutional review boards. At least they must mention that what they did was in accordance with at least Declaration of Helsinki or maybe ICH, GCP, all these other international organizations that promote ethics in research. And also, you have to take in mind that as editors and even reviewers, sometimes maybe, having ethical committee approval does not preclude the editors from making their own judgment about the conduct of the trial. And this is sometimes runs into some controversy. It doesn't mean that if you just write down that this, or even if you mention that there is an ethical approval by a committee, still doesn't mean that maybe the editor might have some questions related to that. So what we sometimes do here, at least in our region and maybe other places, I'm sure sometimes we don't have that ethical approval, and we sometimes just write down that we do. So this is actually not at all ethical. But even if we do that, it doesn't mean again that no questions will come through. So we have to really be watchful for this as well. And so I'm just going to go through this, but I mean, it's very important that we try to set up our IRBs and to have those approvals before sending or even before conducting the trials. So informed consent, it's a very important issue. Informed consent is not just a paper. It's not just a document. Informed consent is a process. If you want to obtain informed consent from a patient or for a volunteer, it's not just putting down a piece of paper and just taking 1 or 2 minutes to explain something of the trial and then having them sign it. Informed consent is a process. It means that it involves a lot of things which shouldn't be complicated like this cartoon is showing. So if we go to the Nuremberg Code, 1949, the first time it was developed, the voluntary consent of human subject is absolutely essential for the clinical trials. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, to be situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any elements of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other from other constraints or coercions. Have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. So it's very important that we have to make sure that they're autonomous, that they have to decide themselves, The protocol, everything has to be explained in simple language to them, and they have to be able to decide themselves, and they can withdraw at any time they want. And you have to tell them exactly what the side effects are, what will happen, and make sure that they understand fully before they want to consent. So I think this is very important. The informed consent, again, is not something, in our papers, in the manuscripts we send, it's only one line. Okay, just the informed consent was obtained. Sometimes it hasn't actually been obtained. Sometimes it's been obtained orally, but it's not written. So we don't even explain that. We just say it's been obtained. But usually it was oral. Okay, but even that one line involves a lot of procedure behind it. So we should try to, if you want to do a really good clinical trial, we should go through all these steps. The informed consent, as I said, it actually has almost 3 parts. You need the information. You have to assure that there's comprehension and that there's voluntariness. So all this is very important. So as I said, the information should be very clear. Sometimes you might need video presentations, you might need pamphlets, you have to give time to the people, the volunteers. You give them a pamphlet, they go home, they study it, they come back maybe 2 days from now, they go consult with other people. So you have to, all of those things actually have to go to the IRB as well. Whatever you use for informed consent has to be approved by the Institutional Review Board. If you use a video, if you use a pamphlet, whatever you use, it has to be definitely approved first. Sometimes you need the village chief. You have to talk to them, you go to the mosque. You have to do a lot more than just giving a form and asking someone to, like we did trials in Africa a lot. And we had to first see the village chief before actually conducting the trial. He would come with us, and then we go to a special place where we meet all the villagers there, and then we explain this. So it's very important that you know the culture as well. The culture is very important. So comprehension is very important. You have to make sure that the person really understands what the protocol is about. As I said, the voluntariness is also very important. Anytime they want, they can come out of the project, and they should be treated with other means. Another term that is very important, I don't know how many people are aware of this, is called assent. Other than informed consent, now we have another term that's called assent, which is usually used for children or adolescents. So in clinical trials, nowadays, some of the actually companies who are sponsoring it or funding it are actually asking for assent. So what is believed is that maybe a child, usually above 7 years of age, although this type of age limit is a bit controversial and there are different views on that. But psychologically, they presume that a 7-year-old child or older, they can decide on their own sometimes about different things. So now what they're asking is, although you get the guardian to sign the informed consent or the parent to sign the informed consent, you should also have another form ready for the child, which is called the assent form. You should ask assent from the child so they can take part in the research. The form is much simpler than the informed consent form, and the language used is much simpler. And then when you explain that, the child will sign, and then this will show that they have been part of the research. And this actually has been very helpful because when you do this, you're actually respecting the child. So when you respect the child or adolescents, then they take a firmer commitment to partake in your research. So it has a very good positive feedback, I think. And we did this in Ethiopia, we did this in a few other countries, we got assents, but I think the age we used was between 12 to 18. We didn't use the 7-year-old age, but when I was looking through the literature, I saw that some places even 7 and above we can get assent. So again, some journals might want you to show them your informed consents, so you have to have them ready, so it's not always like this that you just mention something and you just go away. Because they might ask you for them, ask you for copies, maybe, I don't know, sometimes. They might ask you send you the copy of the IRB. So if you just say, okay, we had IRB approval, and then they ask you for the copy, then you get into some problems. So I think it's very important, even they might ask you for assent copies or something like that. Although there are some confidentiality problems with this as well. I mean, I'm not sure how much confidentiality can be respected with respect to asking for all of these documents. So the journals also have this type of problem too. They don't know what to do with this, because if they get some information from you, they're actually breaching the confidentiality in a sense. So that's why they're asking you to give the statement. Because if you send them the forms, or you send them the picture of the patient with this consent for everything, actually they are now breaching the confidentiality themselves. So we get to that later a little bit. So now we get to the confidentiality and privacy part. Again here, we want our patients to know that we take their privacy very seriously. Just by masking, as Tom was saying, just by putting a bar on the face of someone doesn't mean that you're masking them, or you cannot find their identification. So patient privacy and confidentiality is important. The patients have a right to privacy, and identifying information like names, initials, hospital numbers, photographs, pedigrees, you saw the example there, should not be published unless it's essential for scientific purposes. In that case, if you want to publish, this is another informed consent. You don't have to mix it up with the other one. The other one was informed consent for research. This is informed consent for the patient being identified, maybe. And sometimes the lesion is very close to the eye, so what can you do? If you block the eyes or something like that, then you can't see the lesion. So sometimes you run into these problems. So you need to get the informed consent. And it's very interesting that, I think it's ICMJU that says the patient should see the manuscript before you send it. So he has to see the picture, so he has to see the photograph, see the pedigree before. So maybe answer to the question, to Tom's question about the pedigree is, if the relative sees the pedigree before you send it and they're okay with it, maybe it's okay, I don't know. So this written informed consent, this is about the photograph and about identification, should be archived by the journal or by the authors or both. But as I said, some journals, they prefer that only the author keeps it. Because the problem is if they get it, then that breaches the confidentiality, in a sense. Because other people in the journal are seeing this. And it's only on the other part was the only author was seeing that. And the requirements for informed consent should be definitely included in the journal instruction to authors. So that's another part that sometimes we don't see as far as the editors are concerned. They don't write, what exactly they want from you, as far as informed consent and IRB approval, etc. And again, about clinical trial registration, this is also another topic that came up. So what do we call a clinical trial? Any research study that prospectively assigns human participants or groups of humans to one or more health-related interventions to evaluate the effects on health outcome. So this is a clinical trial. The ICMG decided that from July 1st, 2005, no clinical trials will be considered for publication unless they were included on a clinical trial registry. So as we discussed before, this is the problem that happened, because we talked about the integrity of research, how much can we accept this, and how much we accept the publications. One of the problems was that many of these trials were going on, and they were not very transparent. Or maybe the results were sometimes negative, and they were not published. Some side effects would come up, but no one would know about it. So now they came up with this decision that maybe it's best to have places where the protocol and research should be registered. So in case you're not certain, if someone is a researcher and they're not certain that they should register or not, they usually say it's better to register. Or at least try to contact the journal to make sure that, if you want to send it to a specific journal, you can explain before you want to start, if I need to do this registration or not. Because usually this is only for clinical trials, so not for everything. So you have to watch out, you have to differentiate between clinical trials and other kinds of studies. In October 2008, the revised Declaration of Helsinki also stated that every clinical trial must be registered in a publicly accessible database before recruitment of the first subject. This was also again approved by Declaration of Helsinki. And the WHO also moved into this arena as well, and they stated that the mission of this clinical trial, because they have also a very big portal for registry they can use, to ensure that a complete view of research is accessible to all those involved in healthcare decision-making. This will improve research transparency and will ultimately strengthen the validity and value of the scientific evidence base. So now almost all of the players, the big players here, are promoting this type of clinical trial registration. However, it also has its people who are not very favorable with this type of clinical trial registration. And I think it was mostly the small journals, because they were saying, we don't have that many researchers and that many articles, manuscripts coming in. And now if we put this other requirement, then we won't have any more even. We'll have less coming in. But for the big journals, it's no big deal. They might lose 20%, but they still have so much articles coming. There's some talk about internet access. Some people have access or don't have access. In any case, it's but nowadays actually, if you really want to have your work published somewhere, it's much better. It's really recommended that you have it registered at one of the sites. The ICMJE accepts registration in the following registries. They're from different countries, from Japan, Australia, and the clinicaltrials.gov is also a very big one. But also WHO has now a big portal, and they also have, there are lots of other registries that are under the WHO portal. Like also Iran has one right now, which is under the WHO portal. So a lot of countries are developing this, and you can register on any of those, and you're still acceptable. It's still acceptable for the journals. Now there's a problem with the language sometimes, because if you're from another country and you have your own registry in your own country, you can register there. The only problem is that not everyone else can see it, because not everyone will understand that language. So now the minimal data in English is still required for now, but they're still working on some sort of compromise how you can do it. Maybe you can have the full thing in your own language, but maybe just a small summary of it in English or something. So I think there's talk between WHO and ICMG to try to figure out the best way to deal with this. And lastly, about animal research, that's also another thing that's, again, for our region, maybe was sometimes taken for granted, and for other regions as well, maybe. Nowadays, there's a lot of work done on animals, and this also has to be taken care of, because a lot of these journals might not accept your work because that you've reached some of the things that maybe you should have thought about before doing this. So for authors should include, when you're doing work on animals, you should definitely have the animal welfare details. You have to specify them. What the species are, the number, the gender, the age, the weight, how they're kept, how they're treated, what happens to them afterwards. And a lot of times they say, okay, we did this, we biopsied them, and then that's it. Yeah, but what happened? What happened to at the end? If they died or whatever, how was this done? So all the steps should be explained, especially in the methods section. And you should also make sure that it was done in a sense that the animal had suffered the least. So all the authors are strongly urged to comply with institutional. So you have institutional regulations, you might have national regulations, you might have international guidelines. So I think it's much better for you to be aware of your own country's regulations as well as the international regulations if you want to publish something which has been done on animals. I'll put some of the names here. Arrive is there, but the most important one I think that ICMJ also puts a lot of stress on is the International Association of Veterinary Editors Consensus Author Guidelines on on animal ethics and welfare. The one that I've highlighted. So if you want to do some work on animal research and experiments, it's much better to look at this before you want to conduct that research. And actually the referees are also asked to comment sometimes. So sometimes maybe the editors will ask the referees to definitely comment on the ethical aspects of this animal research that was done. And they might have some problems with that, so this might compromise your paper or your manuscript. A brief statement indicating the institution or licensing body approving the experiment must be included in the article. So you definitely have to also mention that which criteria or which sort of guidelines you use for this type of research, animal research. And here again, it's EMAMI. As I mentioned again this afternoon, the organization is open to everyone, the editors, editorial members, researchers, and academics in the region. And you can also join us by this, just going to the website. There's some also reports of the previous conferences, as well as some of the, there's a manual for editors that was prepared by Imami at WHO, which is available in, I think, Arabic, English, and French, which you can use. I think it's free, you can download it. It's a manual for editors, I think, medical editors. Anyway, thank you very much. And this is Persepolis, again, as I mentioned, about 60 kilometers from Shiraz, dates back to 2,500 years ago. It's one of the oldest necropolises in the world. Thank you very much for your attention. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer, or try to answer. Yes, please, ma'am.
I have a question from the perspective of the IRB. If it comes to the notice of the IRB that a study has been published, in which there was a statement that this study has been approved by the IRB when in fact it hasn't been, what are the obligations of the IRB?
So I don't know if everyone got the question. If a study has been published, in the study or in the article it's been mentioned that there was IRB approval, but then the IRB finds out of that institution and they find out that they hadn't approved it, and now it's published. I think this is one of the situations that probably will be retracted.
But does the IRB have to notify the journal?
I think it should, because there's no other way anyone will find out. The editor will never find out. The reviewers probably won't. But it's only the IRB will know. And so if the IRB doesn't notify the editors, I don't think they'll find out. So I think they should. Yes, please.
Yeah. That depends upon the trust between the author and the editor. We do not accept any manuscript unless accompanied by an IRB approval or acceptable approval letter. Just mentioning it or giving a number doesn't satisfy us. We don't believe it. They have to produce a copy of the IRB report or assessment report, only then we come. That's all. Yes, also share your response.
At the same time, there is some practical problems with that, because when there is a multi-center study which is conducted in multiple countries, recently I have done a submission to JAD Journal of American Academy of Dermatology. There they mandate submission of all IRB letters before submission. So where the study was conducted in 15 centers, so each IRB letter is around 10 to 15 pages. So 15 pages we had around 600 to 700 pages. Most of the pages are scanned. It's a huge thing of around 75 MB size, which we are not able to upload to the JAD system. They use manuscript syndrome. So we tried 2-3 days, we wrote back to the journal editor. They said no, without this we won't be able to accept it. Then finally we had to copy all this and different pages and email to them.
Yeah. I think that's the problem nowadays because, unfortunately, as I said before, the pressures on people and, trying to publish and everything is going to wrong ways of doing things. Now, at the end, we have other checks now coming in, and then when the other checks come in, then we try to find another way around it, and then another check comes in. It's a vicious cycle. Because before they only accepted whatever you said, but now they want to see the documents.
And we were surprised to see that out of that 600-700 pages, I think the publishers or the editors must have checked and they have found out some data discrepancy in 2 letters. They wrote back to us. So that's the way they take it up. So it's very important.
Yeah, I think it's also, the IRBs are very important, but even the IRB, being part of an IRB also needs the training too, and I think that's also another place that, especially maybe in our region, we have to work a little bit more on it too. But some other places are very strict about even one word you use. One word is a little bit up and down, they just don't approve it or they ask you to change it. Usually they give recommendations because it's not like, sometimes they don't flatly reject it, they might give you some recommendations on how to make it better. But you have to submit everything to them, even advertisements for recruitment, everything. Any questions or comments? So I guess with this, the session for today, at least it's finished, and we'll see you tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.
Yes, that's